Hi there everyone and welcome to today's live webinar. My name is Claire, I'm the events manager for Witherslack Group and I'll be hosting this session today, which is focusing on autism and boys. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome back a wonderful speaker for you today, and that is Anne-Marie Harrison from Ideas Afresh Education. We've worked with Anne-Marie many times over the years on various events and webinars, and it is always wonderful to be listening to her present. So just to let everybody know this morning that the webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything or have to dip out, having technical issues, you will get a link to watch the recording again in your own time, and that'll be with you in the next sort of day or two. At the end of Anne-Marie's presentation, we will be holding a Q&A session. I can see that we've got quite a lot of people joining us this morning, so we probably will have quite a lot of questions coming in. So please do just send them through as early as you can by the chat function, which is in the control panel on the side of your screen. So that's about it from me, really. So enjoy, thank you for joining, and now I'll hand you over to Anne-Marie.
Hi everybody, thank you for putting this time aside, and I hope I do manage to live up to that lovely introduction. I offer training and one-to-one support, so if there is any follow-up anyone would want, please don't hesitate in asking and contacting us. And I'm delighted this morning to be talking about autism because, as I'm told, it's one of my special interests, but also looking very much at our perspectives around autism and our boys. We've kind of heard a lot in social media recently about autism and girls and how girls have kind of missed that diagnostic process, and sometimes our diagnostic process is more suited to boys. So we're going to just do a little bit of exploring around that this morning and why that maybe came to be, but also really sort of look at later on some of the sort of top tips that we can use to support our boys in particular. But of course, everything that I talk about is suitable for any children. It's very much about really understanding our child's presentation, almost irrespective of their gender, almost, you know, irrespective of their label, their diagnostic label. It's very much about understanding them as an individual, and so we can sort of seek better understanding and support their learning and put some changes in place if we feel that that's the right time to do it and what we need to be doing. And of course, this time of year, it's a time when we're all sort of coping with changes in our environment, changes in our home, changes in our routine. So, you know, for some of our autistic children, it's a very challenging time. And, you know, Claire and I were just saying, actually, for lots of children and lots of families, it's a very challenging time. So hopefully by the time we've chatted this morning, we'll have some sort of signposts and some ideas of sort of where we should go. And I think this signpost sort of just highlights that, really, that we're thinking about, you know, are we going this way or that way, or should we be going somewhere else with this? And I think it's not unusual as parents, and certainly parents of neurodiverse children, to be sort of feeling like we're not quite sure which way to turn. So hopefully by the time we've chatted this morning, you'll feel like you've got that blue sky there and some clear sort of ideas of where you might like to go, and perhaps if you would like to put some changes in. So not letting you sit resting this morning, I'm going to be doing some polls and encouraging you to just sort of think about answering those, because when we're thinking about signposts and noticing different behaviours, that kind of, you know, observing and deciding whether there's kind of a decision on our child's part in terms of their engagement, and sort of what does that look like. So, you know, does it look like our children perhaps aren't going to involve themselves in play, or is it more likely that actually they're just not yet enabled to involve themselves and share attention? Or is it more the fact that they're just spontaneously disinclined to seek further involvement and interaction and attention? So what does this really mean? Is it that actually they're making a choice, or is it that in some ways they perceive that as, or we perceive that as, a bit of a rejection? So it's about really sort of knowing how to move forward and really looking at our children's interactions as that opportunity for better teaching, for being more concise perhaps in the way that we're working. So let's start off with our first sort of true or false question. And the first question is, autism spectrum disorder can be noticed earlier in boys than girls. So we're going to run a poll and Claire's going to be sorting that for us. And what we'd like you to do is just answer that question as to whether you think that is true or false. So autism can be noticed earlier in boys than it can in girls. So this will sort of just set our scene when we're thinking about our boys. So the poll's open now, so do feel free to just have a think about that. Do you think autism is noticed earlier in boys than it is in fact in girls? It's always a good chance to just take a guess.
Hi, Anne-Marie. The poll was actually worded the other way round on the screen. And so it will be difficult to know the answer here of which way round. But we could always try doing it again. So the way you phrased it was, autism can be noticed earlier in boys than girls, and as it appeared on the screen, it says autism can be noticed earlier in girls than boys.
Oh, sorry.
And so I'm not quite sure whether people will have answered it based on what you said or based on what popped up on the screen. So I'll just give you the results and maybe we can work from there. So we got 54% said true and 46% said false.
So actually, even if the question
quite balanced, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because even if the question had been the way round, then it appears that I'm no mathematician, but it appears that we'd have remained a bit balanced on that anyway, wouldn't we? So we'll take that, Claire, don't worry. And I think it's worth sort of just picking up on that, actually, that, you know, whilst sort of research shows us that the ratio numbers are in actual fact still sort of 4-to-1. So Autism Speaks in 2022, they actually did a piece of research and identified that many of the typical identifiers are noted in male play, but may be overlooked by a female presentation. And I thought this is kind of an interesting point to pick up on. And I had a mum recently actually who shared, she gave me a lovely example of this, because she shared how she'd immediately had concerns about her son's behaviour, because he would drag a hand to the fridge rather than speak. And his play was around lining cars up right on the edge of the windowsill. And she said, heaven help her if she moved those cars, or, you know, if they weren't just balanced perfectly on the edge of that windowsill. And she said that really sort of flagged concerns up with her. And then interestingly enough, her daughter much later got a diagnosis as well. And the mum said, thinking back, her little girl would line up her My Little Ponies by fences on the floor, but they accepted this as regular play. And the little girl would say, now then, let's see what's to drink, which they all thought was rather cute and didn't sort of pick this up as a kind of repetitive phrase or echolalic phrase, as we term it, when we're repeating and using those kind of common phrases that we've perhaps heard, and sometimes do fall in context and sometimes don't. And so I think sometimes identifying our children's autism can look very different, and there's a lot of sort of atypical behaviour that we often see in boys that gets noted much more quickly and noted sooner than perhaps it does in girls. So that leads us nicely into our next question, which I'll just check, Claire, that we have got the same wording, because it could be that I've just not updated my notes. So my wording is: autistic boys do not tend to mask or camouflage autism.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read it out to you. So we've got here, boys do not mask their autistic traits.
Yep. Yeah. So let's roll with that one and see how people think on that one. So boys do not mask their autistic traits. Do we think that's true or false?
Okay, so I've closed that one now. So we've got 47% said yes and 53% said no.
So again, a fairly sort of balanced sort of opinion really there. And I'm going to draw actually on the work of Simon Baron-Cohen to help me in sort of answering that question, giving a little bit more clarity over that, because he did a lot of work looking at testosterone levels, and there's still some ongoing research, but in 2009 he kind of made this sort of revelation really around autism being very sort of entrenched in perhaps where testosterone levels are, and that has an influence. But in actual fact, you know, he wasn't really referring to gender. He was referring to biochemical differences in our children's autism. And so personality, development, biochemical behaviors are all part of the autism spectrum for our boys, but also for girls. And so it is really interesting that actually I often work with families, and I've got a family at the moment actually who you know, school are saying, well, we've got absolutely no problem at school, he's doing great, he's really settled, so we don't really see any of these autistic traits at school. And I imagine that a lot of that sort of 40+% that felt that perhaps boys don't always mask or camouflage their autism, they probably are having opposite experience, where in actual fact their experience is that their boys are very kind of open and very apparent in terms of their coping with their autistic presentation, whereas for some boys their presentation of autism can be much more subtle. And of course, because of the nature of autism, the very fact that their social involvement, their social behaviours in school compared to home or compared to their other settings that they might go to often can look very different. And that's just the same for our boys as it is for our girls, that sometimes they may present more apparent, and other times they may actually be much more skilled in sort of copying their peers or going along with behaviours that their peers are actually demonstrating as well. And of course, some of our autistic boys are the ones that sort of stand out, but stand out by a kind of almost jovial or sort of masking mannerism. You know, one mum who tells me that, you know, her son is kind of the family entertainer and sort of would be labelled sort of the class clown, but in a very endearing sort of way, that he keeps everybody well entertained. So, you know, a little boy there that perhaps is masking, but in a very overt sort of way. So sometimes it's very much about really trying to unravel the behaviours that we're actually seeing. And that leads us into our sort of final poll, which my question is around autistic boys sometimes show earlier language concerns than girls. Is that kind of similar wording to yours, Claire, or?
So what we've got here is autistic boys frequently show language development delays.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Let's go with that. So autistic
Okay.
boys frequently show language development delays.
Okay, so that's launched now, ready for people to vote.
See if that's true or false.
Okay, so I've closed that now, and the results are 72% said true, 28% said false.
Absolutely interesting, isn't it, that there's that kind of push towards this, because, and actually it's a really interesting area with lots of ongoing global research. And I'm going to draw on a couple of professors, Andrew Pickles and Robin Cushell, who have just actually published an article in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry around their ongoing research, which, as I say, has been a global sort of participation. They've been looking at language regression and sort of been looking at the way in which our boys sort of more inclined to demonstrate those differences in language. And one of their sort of outcomes is that they've been looking at whether perhaps we are inclined to sometimes explain away some of those indicative behaviours. And so sometimes we perhaps are inclined to say things like, oh, well, you know, he's a very busy boy, or he's too interested in other things to want to chat. And sometimes families talk about the fact that their children were chatting, their language appeared to be developing very typically, and then for some reason that sort of stopped and there was almost a regression in language development. And what their research is showing, that actually even if that happens, that later down the line, when these children are reviewed, these boys are reviewed at age 9 or 10, that actually the language development regression didn't impact on long-term language acquisition or long-term communication. So it's quite an interesting but still an ongoing area of research. But I think what kind of resonated particularly with me was this fact that sometimes we miss or we excuse some of the indicators, some of the signposts and behaviours in our boys, because we, you know, pass them away as you know, oh, he's just a typical boy, he's very busy, he's very boisterous, he's rather be climbing than chatting, and those kinds of things. And I think we've got some stereotypical sort of building blocks out there that we are perhaps needing to challenge, because of course, you know, just like all autistic children, in actual fact, you know, things are not always as they seem. And so it might be that you know, one little brick appears to be sort of the same as any other, but actually for our children in particular, those differences are really significant. And here's a nice example of that. So a guy, Sam, who's 29, was talking about his job, his role at work, and he said that his special interest has led to his job. And he said, you know, he thinks it's really important to do what you love to do until it becomes your job. But what I want to also flag up is that Sam also commented that he never felt any different. He never recognized that he was autistic, and actually his diagnosis came as a bit of a shock to him, and he just sort of accepted that he was how he was. And there's another guy who wrote a book called Pete Warmby, and he's had a book published by Jessica Kingsley recently, and it's called What I Want to Talk About. And he says that he used his interests to regain a sense of calm in a scary, stormy world, and that his games of Sonic Hedgehog and Mario felt like an escape hatch for him, which is really kind of comparative to Sam's comments that he never ever felt any different. And so I think these two perspectives are just a bit of a reminder for us that the value of sort of really knowing our own individual son's experience of autism, and understanding that, you know, despite the media impression that boys present in a certain autistic manner or in a certain way, and that language is a certain way and the behavior is a certain way, that actually things may not always appear the same. And apart from sort of noticeable differences, there may be some subtle indications as well. So I think to meet the diagnostic criteria, our boys would be demonstrating some significant differences. Of course they would, in their social and their communication, and also their sensory repetition. And I know in school it's very sometimes typical that there's a presentation that people think and accept as that child being autistic, but in actual fact sometimes that presentation, as we've already said with our poll, can in fact be masked. And I think sort of to test that theory, to test the theory of observation, it's so important that we are very aware and that we are looking out. And I think, you know, it's important we don't dismiss the fact that sometimes what we see as difference in behaviours can lead, you know, to a job at the end of the day. But I think it's worth sometimes questioning ourselves and testing our own theory, and to do that I've certainly spent a good deal of time observing autistic boys and fathers at play, and my observation is that our most natural and most sort of accurate information, especially in our world where we are very much filled with terminologies and research papers. You know, I've even quoted research papers this morning, and we're seeing that diagnostic reprofiling where we're looking at a broader sort of scooping up of the perspectives of autism, that it is actually quite easy for us to lose sight of the fact that actually our best signpost really to understanding our boys' behaviours is to look out for them. You know, some parents comment that their child showed no signs of autism until they were around 3 years of age, and that, you know, that sort of apparent regression, as I mentioned already, has been and is continuing to be sort of researched. But I think for us, you know, as parents, as professionals, as people involved with our autistic boys, that once we notice that there's changes in development and differences in behaviour, you know, and perhaps even got a diagnosis, it doesn't actually change who our child is. And hopefully it just opens our eyes sort of more clearly to how your child understands the world, and why you making changes will help to sort of put the bricks in the right place for them, and help to build the best and more successful environment for them. And I think sometimes you know, building that right environment is where as parents, as professionals, our challenges really lie. I think it's so important that we don't get sort of, you know, bricked in a way by all that research and all that information, and become kind of almost distracted from noticing and working with our child. I think, you know, letting the academics do their bit is really important, but actually when it comes to practically supporting and being sort of on the ball with our boys on a day-to-day basis, you know, each day they're getting older, each day they're growing up, and we want to be able to make sure that we are creating the best possible environment for that to happen. And that, you know, sometimes being mindful of the fact that actually we give mixed messages. And I think you know, this is very kind of topical at the moment, so it's a good analogy to use, that actually, you know, we use sort of our Christmas trees as a bit of a message here for us. So, you know, thinking about, are we very good, are we very clear in the messages that we do give to our boys? You know, we talk about respecting nature and perhaps go on a family or a country walk together, and we talk about not pulling off the branches or not pulling off the leaves and that sort of thing. And yet here we are at the moment chopping trees down and bringing them into our homes. And, you know, because they are evergreens, it was actually considered to bring trees into our homes for good fortune. You know, it's a tradition, and sometimes we can take that message of tradition to help us to teach in context and make those traditions sort of relevant for our family. And we all have traditions that are relevant. We all have behaviors, we all have repetitive activities, and at this time of year sometimes that's when they actually come out. I know, you know, my own children would quote Sunday teas of sort of chips in a basket and watching gladiators. And these kind of traditions and connections are really important, and never more important than sort of this time of year. And to an extent, there's a reassurance in them, because actually routines and repetition are not only enjoyable to most of us, but actually they form an important part of who we are. They form an important connection of supporting our autistic boys, because they can serve a good reminder. And I often think, you know, it's about making sure that we are teaching what's behind a particular perspective, what's behind those particular traditions, perhaps even down to the simplest of things, like, you know, why do we wait in a queue? Why don't we all just rush through a doorway together? Or why don't we all move forwards to get served at the same time? And of course, those are some of the things that, you know, we need to spend time looking at, different ways of supporting and understanding those social expectations. And I know, you know, I've mentioned Carol Gray's social stories in the past, and I think, you know, this time of year that sort of approach can be really, really helpful. And then I also think, you know, we're calling on an element of bravery around this time of year. I think, you know, imagine if each one of those boxes under that tree there was an awesome opportunity, and perhaps an answer to a mystery or a question that you've wondered about for quite some time, but you were never actually brave enough to kind of come forward and open that box and take that risk. And I think supporting our boys sometimes feels like a calculated risk, because one of our parental responsibilities, and especially when we're parenting vulnerable children, and I kind of use that word vulnerable very much on purpose, because we know from research that actually the theory of mind and that ability to really kind of understand things from other people's perspective can be, for some of our children, one of those sort of areas that's quite challenging. And that encouraging that challenge to, you know, address that challenge, don't be sort of shying away from it, and thinking in terms of not only encouraging our children to be brave enough to take that sort of social risk, but also thinking about how they take physical risks. Is there things that we can do? Is there a gift we can give them? Is there a way and a means that we can support them in that? And I know, you know, if there's sort of physical activity groups that boys can join, it can be really helpful. I know one family who, you know, gets great support from their children being party to a parkour group. So that very kind of tailored way of helping them to climb safely, land safely. I know a grandma recently who took some emotional risks. Her husband had passed away, and she went through some photographs with a little young person that she has in her family who has a diagnosis. And sometimes taking those social risks at this time of year around sort of exchanging gifts, and how will that be received? What will that feel like when we actually take that risk? And I think what I'm sort of doing here with this tree is just encouraging us to think about what are the gifts that we've got at our fingertips that we can already give to our boys and that we can move forward with. And so I'm going to just move now into sort of some top tips that we can move forward with, and some ways and means that can be helpful. And we've sort of touched on a few, and I'll scoop up a few now as we just go through this sort of top tips for our Christmas tree. So it's kind of thinking about these next sort of 10 things hopefully will be ways of helping to keep our boys, as you know, feeling like the stars at the top of their tree. And I think sometimes we find, and that they find, that this time of year especially can throw up a lot of challenges, and we see some changes in behavior, and maybe school even see changes in behavior. And for some, you know, that can be a bit of a revelation, and for others it can be a challenge. So what we want to do is equip ourselves with sort of the best possible chance that we have of keeping our boys at the top of their own little personal trees. So the first thing I want to sort of put on our tree is to think about how we can show things so that they are understood at a glance. So, and I think at this time of year we fall back on things like lots of lists, and of course we all learn and work differently, and we know from research that our autistic boys are probably likely to be very good visual learners and to remember things visually with more ease. And I recently heard a mention of the fact that actually looking at a list calls on a different area of our brain than it does to looking at a picture. And I often quote when I'm delivering training the fact that actually there's a good reason that our road signs are visual symbols, and they're not messages saying please drive at 70 miles an hour when it's a dual carriageway, and please drive at 60 miles an hour on a single carriageway road unless otherwise stated, because we can't actually take that information in quickly enough for it to carry any relevance. So what we do need to do is make sure that instead of using lists, that actually we're using visual representations, we're using visual messages that our boys can just simply glance at. And so the glance can give that profound message. So I think offering a glance is our first top tip. And then our second tip is to think about how we structure events with, as Sam and mentioned earlier, that talking about those escape hatches. You know, are we making sure that when we are attending something that, you know, this time of year, maybe a family gathering or maybe a school activity or event that's out of the regular demands of the day, that we've made sure that our boys know how they can appropriately get out of that? Have they got an appropriate escape hatch that they can use, that they can engage with? You know, but being factual about that, being open and clear about that, so that they're not having to use behaviours in order to escape something that's perhaps a bit overwhelming or too confusing or sensory overload, that we have actually equipped them with a way of sort of escaping. So our boys' escape hatch is our tip number 2. And then number 3, I think remembering that actually it's okay to have some things that we don't give the detail of, that sometimes surprises are okay. I think it's a bit of a myth that autistic children don't like surprises. Some autistic children don't like surprises, but some actually do. So do a little bit of exploring. I'm sure by now you're probably very aware whether your son can cope with a surprise or not. And if you're not, then do a little bit of research and just see if a little surprise is something that actually can bring some pleasure. Sometimes using novelty and using surprise for some profiles of autism can actually be a real advantage. So exploring about surprises is another little hanger on our tree. And then our 4th hanger on our tree is about remembering to use those interests, to engage those interests. Think about that lineup of cars at the garage there, that actually we don't know where our son's skills and abilities are going to take them. And it's so important that we don't dismiss them. And then the 5th tip is around supporting our boys' sensory responses, being aware of the difference in smells, in sights, in sounds, in things that are going on at this time of year, and preparing them for that. So maybe just bringing the tree in and having it in the house for a few days before we actually do anything with it, so that we're just gradually building up to understanding and coping with some of those big changes that perhaps the rest of the family have you know, equal right to experience as well. So our 6th tip is to really think about minimizing that impact, and when we are sort of taking the risk of perhaps moving forward, perhaps having a Christmas tree for the first time, that we make sure that we reveal the thinking behind that, that we explain logically and factually. You know, we know when the tree goes up, when it's going to come down again, but have we communicated that to our boys? Have we made that very clear information for them? And then number 7, we're thinking about trying to make those sort of requests and expectations very real and fun, perhaps using things like, you know, paper chain countdowns rather than lists or numbers, that something more practical might be more appropriate for your particular boys. So again, doing a little bit of exploring, but certainly thinking outside of that typical box a little bit as well. And then number 8, it's about kind of, can we stabilize those walls? You know, can we minimize those worry by being very realistic and being very factual, and making sure that you know, we're reassuring as well, making those connections. You know, remember when you couldn't fix your Lego, but actually this is how we managed to achieve that. And so I think, you know, being clear can be really helpful. And whilst on that subject, I had an interesting experience recently where a little boy told me that he doesn't like playing with Lego at his friends because the Lego tray is all mixed up and the colours are all mixed up. And it really made me think, yeah, for some children actually, just a little bit more organisation can mean a lot. It can offer a lot of clarity. So maybe stabilising those walls with a little bit more realism and organisation, but being factual and reassuring might be helpful for our whole sort of Christmas experience. And then thinking in terms of our sort of final tip here, thinking in terms of, you know, Albert Einstein, I think it can help me out here, that actually if we have been doing the same thing over and over again and we're expecting different results, then we kind of have to question our principles and our thinking behind how we're working. And I think certainly for me, I've had quite a number of families recently who have said things to me like, oh, we don't do that because it's not gone down well in the past. And I think sometimes as parents, we've got to be brave enough to, you know, open that box from under the tree that wasn't there last year and think, actually, is it worth exploring with that again? You know, our children are perhaps from these experiences, for sure, you know, a year older, a year further on. And of course, many of these experiences that we are having in our families, in our towns, our gatherings and things like that will be, for some children, very new experiences because they've been missed over the last couple of years or not perhaps occurred to the same extent. So I guess really what I'm leaving with us before we move into our sort of question and answers is the challenge to think about what hangers we've got on our tree in order to help our boys stay the stars at the top of their trees, and then also to challenge ourselves in terms of, dare we change things, dare we risk making changes, and doing that not by just sort of out of the blue decisions, but doing that by that earlier slide that we looked at, where we're very much thinking in terms of how can we support our boys by observation, by knowing them well, by understanding reactions and responses that we've had in the past, and appreciating that actually they might be very different reactions and responses at school or in different settings than they are at home. And the same, of course, if we're sort of visiting families. So hopefully what I'd like to think is that you're kind of feeling empowered and confident enough to sort of explore some of those approaches. And, you know, if kind of your parenting style and you're engaging with is sort of, you know, driving you to kind of remain safe, then I'm kind of challenging us all really to lift the lid off those gift boxes and make sure that we've not got, you know, some gift hiding in there that we've just not yet really been brave enough to lift out and have a go at. So, you know, are we brave enough to change the way that we're doing things, and have we got that drive? And I think what we'll add into that bravery and that drive is really understanding our boys' communication, understanding their social interaction, understanding their sensory processing, and really appreciating that all of their behaviours are indications, messages, and in many ways clarifying how the world feels for them and how they are experiencing the world. So thank you for listening this morning. Thank you for joining me. I hope I've said something that will just have stirred up your thinking and make maybe resonate in your heart and mind for thinking, is there a hanger on that tree that we can tweak or change or add to? So I look forward to your questions and hope I can help and answer some.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Thanks for that. What a great session. Some really useful advice and really practical stuff for over Christmas as well, which we really appreciate. So we've had quite a lot of questions that have come through, and we'll just try and get through as many as we possibly can in the time that we've got left. So to begin with, we've had one come through from Martin. He says, changing anything in the home for our 12-year-old son causes extreme anxiety. Anything from getting a new carpet or moving the telly. Son is really paranoid about anything moving. We can't even touch the chair that he sits at or accidentally brush past the computer table without raising his anxiety. He triple checks everything. So any advice on how we can change this, or at least try and keep his anxiety levels reduced?
I think definitely allowing things to remain the same that are appropriate to do so, but also maybe looking at kind of where the root of that anxiety is. And so almost kind of flooding him with lots of opportunities of things that he can keep the same. So giving him that sense that he's sort of in control, and involving him in any changes that you do want to make. And I would say, you know, start very, very softly with something that kind of, it doesn't really matter if it's moved or not, or if it's changed or not, but putting him in charge of that, putting him in control of that. And often our children who have got high anxiety, and of course, you know, it might be that you need sort of additional support from the GP or from CAMS services. So, you know, I can't obviously address all the anxiety here, but in terms of autistic anxiety, I think often it's a case of giving our children a sense of the fact that they are in control. And I think, you know, I use this word control with a small c because often people shy away from allowing children to feel that they're in control. But actually, it's almost like giving them as many opportunities to choose things for themselves as they possibly can. Even doing things like, you know, do you want to go to bed now or in 10 minutes? So that we're constantly giving them that sense of, oh, it's okay, you know, I've got this, I'm on this. So, you know, don't be resistant to allowing him to have that sense of everything is the same, he is in control, and then gradually just introduce a change, a tiny weeny bit at a time, with him alongside, with him party to that. So I hope that helps. I know it's kind of a bit of a generic answer, but, you know, by all means, pop an email if you want any more detail.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Okay, so this question has come from Sue-Ann. I firmly believe my son masks. He is one thing in school compared to who he is at home. He regularly expresses how he feels different, that he can't show his feelings at school, and most recently he feels quite conflicted, as he feels that he's lying to his teachers when they ask him how he feels or if he's enjoying school. He will say things that they want to hear. School do not acknowledge that he masks. They regularly tell me it is impossible and gets passed off as attachment problems. How can I engage school to look at masking, or can I what can I do to prove it in some way?
This is so hard, and it is $1 million question, and I'm closely involved with a very similar situation at the moment. And I think the more we can do in terms of supporting our experiences at home and sharing those experiences. I know I actually have written sort of a letter of support for a family because I personally know the child. And I think, if you can do that, it helps you to feel that you're not going mad and that, school are making those judgments. And I think, depending on your son's ability, if he would maybe write down at home for you some of the experiences that he feels he has at school, so that then you can share them, obviously with his permission too. Because sometimes I think that there is a myth that autistic children are not people pleasers, and sometimes our children are so good at masking that they come across as these sort of people pleasers, and the teacher asks a question, they'll give the answer that they think the teacher wants. And so then that really makes the whole situation so much more difficult, because you almost feel like you're lying about your child. And I think, diarying as many examples of the difficulty in behaviours that you experience at home, and diarying them against the day that's happening at school, because sometimes you can actually, when you do that, notice some kind of correlation. So, for example, it might be that, every Tuesday after school is worse than one or other of the other days, and that can be directly connected to maybe that's PE, or maybe they have a Spanish teacher comes in that day, or whatever. So I think sort of to sort of clip my answer, I would say get as much support and sort of additional witnesses kind of thing to share their story, to share your story, to support you in revealing your child from home compared to your child at school. But also keeping a diary that you can then share with school, and working with your child to very much embrace and understand who they are, and to really endorse the fact for them that they have a right to behave as their real self at school, and that it's important that the teacher sees their real self. Because of course, for our children as well, there might be an assumption that it's important that they just appear to be this child that the teacher is kind of giving them the impression that they want to see. And it's kind of so socially and emotionally complex, but actually in essence we have to make sure that our autistic children are comfortable to be who they are wherever they are. And I think we've got a lot of work to do in working in partnership and encouraging school to appreciate that actually it is not unusual for autistic children to try and sort of play the social game.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Okay, so I hope I'm going to read this next question out in the right context and everything. I just thought it was an important one because there might be a few people listening today who are in similar situations. Okay, so please can you give some advice or an example of like an escape route for a 5-year-old in school, perhaps during, I'm guessing it's a situation where they're not 100% comfortable with the example that they've given here is during the nativity. He's very anxious about asking teachers for help. And so that acts as a barrier to him ever, asking for that support. And teachers don't prompt him because he masks at school. And so Mum's sort of saying it feels easier to just keep him home during these last few days of school. Have you got any advice there at all?
Yeah, I think definitely using a physical means of him giving his message. But I think, it might be a case of trying to get school sort of very quickly on board. And I know a little boy who was involved in a nativity play, and he actually had a little toy farm sheep in his pocket, and when he took the sheep out of his pocket, the teacher knew that that meant, you know, he needs to come and sit next to her, and he was overwhelmed, sort of standing on the little stage, as it were. And then I know another school who worked very well in videoing the part of her little boy, and they played it on a backdrop white screen rather than him having to physically be present. So, you know, there's lots of things, there's lots of ways that we can support our children still participating if they want to, but also not pushing them to the point where, you know, their anxiety is sort of sky high, and it's causing distress and causing them perhaps not to want to go to school. So I think, you know, escape routes should be in place all of the time for all of our children. All children should know how they can get out of a situation if they're finding it overwhelming or too much, or, you know, it's causing them real distress. And I often think, you know, something like a token or a sheep, something physical that they can hand to or show, or a signal that they can agree with their teacher, or, you know, their key worker, can be really helpful. So, but you know, that needs obviously setting up with some liaising with the teacher. And I think it's never too late, you know, to say that actually the changes and the play and all of that is causing some stress. So would you mind if we just trialed having this so that my child can go to X, Y, or Z for however long, or, you know, whatever moment they need, maybe just going to the book corner and just, you know, having a quiet moment there. So I hope that helps. I think, you know, a practical sort of liaising with school would be a good way forward.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. I know we are very limited on time now, but I'll just try and squeeze in one or two more questions, if that's okay. So this question has come in and says, I would like some advice on how to reduce my child's constant jumping, which happens at home all the time, particularly after school.
Okay, so again, we've got this thing where I think we can jump to conclusions. So I could immediately say to you, oh, it's probably sensory, but it might not be. It could be to do with social behavior, that he kind of jumps and gets the same response or reaction from someone. It could be a means of communication, but it could also be sensory. So I think, you know, first of all, there's some detective work to do as to where the jumping occurs, when it occurs, does it occur outside of the home, does it occur in other settings, and sort of what the jumping's doing. And once we've detected the root of that, that's when we can move forward. Because if it's a sensory thing, then perhaps a little trumpet or something in the house or outside, if that's practical or feasible, but giving lots of opportunities for that sort of sensory feedback, but also kind of detecting as to whether it is a communication sort of mechanism, or sort of extracting a similar response. So looking for, seeking repetition and predictability. And so all of those things obviously would need kind of a different solution, a different approach. So I think the first thing to do there is some detective work before we can do a kind of, this is the problem, here's the solution. It's very much about that observation that we mentioned this morning.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Okay, so final question today. So I have concerns about autism since my son was 2. School agree that he displays autistic traits but are pushing for an ADHD diagnosis. I explained that he presents as ADHD due to sensory overloads and sensory issues that affect his behaviour. Have you got any advice here?
I think you're absolutely within your rights to go to GP and ask to be referred for autism diagnosis for autism assessment. And there's absolutely, you know, no harm in having exploring the ADHD route as well. Very much these days, you know, we look at this kind of holistic neurodiverse presentation, and of course sometimes for our children their behaviours are what kind of get them a diagnosis initially. And so sometimes autism presentation behaviours can seem a little bit more subtle, but there is between sort of 50 and 70% of children that actually have that sort of dual diagnosis. And I know, you know, the ADHD Foundation, who I work very closely with, you know, they would be saying you know, it's important that we kind of take that neurodiverse approach and don't shy away from either diagnosis, because both of them, you know, will throw some light on to how best to support and work with your particular little boy. So getting an ADHD diagnosis doesn't prevent you from getting an autism diagnosis, nor vice versa. But I would definitely pursue both if you're concerned about particular autism presentations around maybe social interaction, communication, and sensory system processing as well. Because of course all of those actually also occur for many children who have an ADHD diagnosis as well. So this neurodiversity umbrella, you know, is there for good reason, and I think it's okay to pursue both.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. What a great webinar, so informative, and I'm sure everybody found it really, really useful. And so that brings us to the end of our session today. I'd like to say a big thank you to Anne-Marie and to everybody who's joined us. Like I said earlier, a recording of the presentation will be sent out over the next, well, in the next few days probably. So our next event for parents and carers will be focusing on managing sibling relationships, and that'll be presented by Emma Weaver from the ADHD Foundation Neurodiversity Charity. It will take place next Wednesday, the 14th of December. So if anyone would like to register for that or just find out more details, you can visit our website, which is witherslackgroup.co.uk/webinars. So a massive thank you again to Anne-Marie, to everyone for their time today, and we hope to see you again on another webinar very soon. Okay, thanks and bye for now.
Thanks everybody, bye.